currently needed for stimulating economic growth in the post-pandemic recovery. Realizing the pivotal role of energy in the economic development, energy security is the key to achieve just and equitable energy transition, which aim to achieve the enhancement of social, economic, and development aspects while eradicating poverty and protecting those who are affected by the transition. Briefly speaking, from Indonesia's perspective as an Asia-Pacific country and emerging economy, energy security closely related to our basic needs, long-term strategies and planning, and also massive effort to provide sustainable energy access for all, including in the remote areas and islands, and also marginalized groups. For G20, ensuring global energy security in the recent situation of energy transition will be highly challenging and also unprecedented. The recent situation in the global energy markets and prices are becoming the issue which international communities should look after, while G20 members, as the largest energy producer as well as consumers, have to consider to maintain the stability of energy prices. Even G20 cannot face this alone, but needs synergies analysis from international organizations such as IEA, OPEC, IF, global financial institutions, and others is necessary to support market stability. The energy market instability will be hampering our effort on the sustainable recovery as the ambitious plan we have previously set last year to retrieve from global pandemic. The ongoing global energy instability will be also obstructing our struggle to recover together, recover stronger, as the Indonesian presidency has sounded. Global economic recovery does need market stability and supply security. Unless we stabilize global energy market, we will not see the further development of modernized, digitalized, cost-effective, cleaner, and more sustainable energy system and infrastructure, while we will also fail to promote just and inclusive approach in clean energy transition. Without further ado, to the IEA, all key speakers from the global, regional, and national entities, all G20 members, and invited delegates, and Troika, and broader stakeholders, I wish you all have a successful webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Bapak. We wish for the success of the webinar today also. Terima kasih, Bapak. Next, we would like to invite Mr. Nicola Bazzani. He is the Deputy Head Office of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Italy to deliver the welcome speech. Please.
Thank you very much. A very good day to everybody from a sunny, bright day in Rome, Italy. Dear Mr. Chairman, dear Udo, dear colleagues, it's really a pleasure to have the opportunity to address this meeting today because last year Italy ventured during our G20 presidency in a far-sighted endeavor with the IEA support to define a new concept of energy security and collaboration in the transition. You certainly well remember that at the Energy Climate Ministerial meeting, we all together adopted the so-called Naples principles. I'm truly grateful, therefore, to the Indonesian presidency for bringing this work to the next stage in a spirit of continuity and full collaboration across the G20 members and presidency. That's the spirit to go forward and to continue to collaborate together. In this framework, let me highlight some key issues. First, security of supply concerns also affordable, sustainable energy prices. Security of supply is a multifaceted concept that includes affordable and sustainable energy prices. And to fulfill this goal, we do need to involve all the actors of the energy markets. Therefore, dear Mr. Chairman, your appeal to G20 members to OPEC gas exporting countries and beyond for prices stability could not be more timely, and Italy fully supports your efforts. Second, energy efficiency as a national goal to reduce the energy use. Energy efficiency is a real source of energy supply. It allows using less energy to have the same benefits for all consumers, civilian and industrial. Third, the importance of circular economy. Circular economy is a paradigm that can favor and integrate national energy supply. Further, it also contributes reducing the impact of waste that affects major urban environment thanks to the waste to energy cycle. Fourth, we have bottlenecks that affect the infrastructures of the energy markets. We need to increase their resilience, and we should mobilize important investments to be able to adopt innovative technological solutions to have resilient infrastructures. A fifth matter of true importance today is diversification of energy resources, and energy diplomacy shows all its crucial importance at this stage. In Italy, for instance, we have promptly moved on multiple fronts to diversify our energy sources, prevent further tensions on global energy markets, and strengthen collaborations with strategic partners all around the world, in Africa, the Mediterranean, Central Asia, the Gulf, and beyond. We are very grateful to many of you for these collaborations. We have implemented an energy security plan to protect our citizens and our businesses from the excessive spike of energy prices. We are moving together with the big energy companies because we know that the involvement of the private sector is a key for a rapid diversification of energy supplies. But, and this is probably the most important point, at the same time, we remain strongly committed to accelerating the clean energy transitions as a true solution for the sustainability and energy resilience of each single country. To this end, we promote collaborations with all our partners. We are very conscious that many producing countries are deeply affected by climate change, and we remain therefore strongly committed to achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. We have committed 1.4 billion euro per year for the next 5 years, with the overall aim to assist emerging economies in their efforts, including in the energy transitions. We therefore remain committed to the medium and long-term targets of decarbonization, because we think that a clean energy future equals to a free from external energy shocks energy future, to a more prosperous future with a higher GDP and employment rate, a better future, a safer future. I thank you very much indeed, and I wish you a fruitful discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Dear participant, before we move on to the next agenda, we would kindly request you to fill out a questionnaire. The organizing committee will put the link in the chat box, so we would kindly fill out the questionnaire. Okay, distinguished participant, the workshop today is divided into 2 panels, and each panel will present a remark and also a discussion. The discussion will be in a Q&A between the moderator and panelists. And for the first panel, allow me to invite Mr. Widiawan Prawira Atmaja. He is a former OPEC governor of Indonesia to be the moderator. We usually call him Bapak Wawan. Bapak Wawan, are you ready to lead the panel?
Inshallah.
Baik,
Thank you.
please Bapak, you may start your panel.
Thank you. Good afternoon from Jakarta. My name is Widiawan Prawira Atmaja, and feel free to call me Wawan, as the MC has just told you. I'm very honored and privileged to chair these sessions that consists one keynote speaker and a very esteemed panelist later on. Just would like to remind all of you again that the topic of today's webinar is maintaining energy security during the energy transitions. If I may offer to dissect a little bit, maintaining energy security, we may think that this is the problem of today's, of every nation's, right? But we would argue that it will be the problem every day until the future, right? But the future needs to be secure, and the future will have to be secure if we can maintain the increase of temperature within certain limit, and hopefully it's within the 1.5 degree of Celsius. And the even though it's for the future, but the action needs to start today. So I would like to look at it from the point of view of multi-objectives, intertemporal goals that faced by all countries, all nations that are going to do these transitions within all the challenges that seems to be not stopping to keep giving disruptions, right? Whether is the current geopolitical conditions that has resulted in high commodity prices, especially and more importantly on fossil fuel prices, while we are still facing the COVID-19 pandemic that is also need to be addressed in appropriate manner. So we are here today to discuss the issue, and we are very grateful. We have the opportunity to do so in delivering these sessions with the very esteemed speakers. I would introduce the first keynote speakers, Mr. Keisuke Sadamori. He's the Director of Energy Markets and Security from International Energy Agency. He will be enlightening us within the time of about 10 minutes on the state of the global energy markets. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Sadamori-san. The platform is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Widawan. So nice to see you again. A good morning from Paris, which is sunny, but probably less endowed with good sunshine than Rome. Thank you very much for inviting the IEA to this the important workshop on energy security. And before we start the discussions with the panelists, let me briefly set the scene by reflecting on what has been achieved under Italy's presidency and sharing our views on the current market situation. Can you turn on the slide, please? Next one, please. Last year, the G20 approved the Naples Principles for Energy Collaboration, here on the slide. You know them by heart. It is about the energy efficiency first, renewable system integration, diversity of supply, oil and gas security during the transitions, repurposing infrastructure, critical minerals and digitalization, and last but not least, people-centered transitions. Building on and deepening these principles, the IEA is preparing a security report for the G20 Energy Transitions Ministerial in September. Next, please. The oil market is moving closer to balance despite large supply losses stemming from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Lower demand expectations and emergency stock releases are key factors in this rebalancing. Since the outbreak of the war, we have reduced our forecast for global oil demand by more than 1 million barrels per day. And the IEA countries pledged more than 280 million barrels from their reserves that are coming to the market in the months to come. The demand revision stems from a weaker outlook for Russia, the aviation sector, and the surge in COVID cases in China. Even so, the global oil demand is still expected to grow by 1.9 million barrels per day in 2022 to 99.4 million barrels per day. At the same time, we are starting to see a fall in Russian oil supply, with recent reports suggesting production in April has fallen by nearly 1.3 million barrels per day compared to March. While the outlook remains highly uncertain, we see the potential for losses expanding to nearly 3 million barrels per day from May, as sanctions and embargoes against Russia comes into full effect and as buyers step away from new deals. The OPEC plus production, crude production in March held steady at 44.1 million barrels per day. As a result, their combined production trailed 1.5 million barrels per day below their target in March, compared to a deficit of 1.1 million barrels per day in the previous month. As for the IEA's collective actions, on the 1st of April, the IEA member countries agreed to release 120 million barrels of emergency oil stocks, and that's the largest release in the history of the IEA. This comes on top of the 62.7 million barrels that the IEA decided to release in March as an initial response following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And that's a total of nearly 183 million barrels coming from the IEA's collective actions, including nearly 50 million barrels of refined products. In addition, the United States will release 100 million barrels of their SPR stocks in the coming months. So this oil will be progressively coming online over the period from March to October, with a specific type of oil and timeline for deliver, depending on each country's emergency systems and circumstances. The IEA's emergency stock releases provided welcome relief to markets that already had low buffer of stocks and spare capacity prior to this crisis. And these actions demonstrate the strong unity and willingness to protect the global economy from the social and economic impacts of this current crisis. Next, please. As for the demand side, the IEA launched on the 18th of March the 10-point plan on reducing oil demand in advanced economies, with practical advice on how lower demand can reduce current market uncertainty and volatility. Actions include reducing business travel, working from home, using public transport, and car-free Sundays, and others. While the IEA actions focus on advanced economies, the impact would be even higher, of course, if they are adopted in emerging economies as well. Next, please. Let me turn to the gas market. So the global, the LNG market will remain very tight due to limited additional export capacity and higher LNG flows to Europe to reduce dependence on Russian gas. And Europe will remain the premium LNG market for the rest of the year, $2 to $3 per million BTU ahead of the Asian spot LNG. Next, please. On the 3rd of March, the IEA released a 10-point action plan together with the European Union with a series of measures that can reduce Russian natural gas imports with 50 BCM or 1/3 within 1 year. And they include not signing any new gas contracts with Russia and maximizing gas supplies from other sources. They're mostly LNG. Ensuring gas storage is filling ahead of the next winter, lifting all barriers in permitting for accelerating the deployment of solar and wind, making the most of existing low emissions energy sources such as nuclear and renewables, the ramping up energy efficiency measures in home and businesses, and simply reducing gas use. Next, please. As for the electricity market, a more rapid deployment of renewable is key to both enhance diversification of supply and achieve affordable generation costs. Despite the major progress in renewable deployment and cost reductions, electricity prices are very high today, reflecting fossil fuel price hikes. Renewable generation costs are affected by the current high commodity prices, but they remain much lower than the wholesale electricity prices in many countries. And offshore wind can also compete at the current prices. So more renewable capacity is needed, and there's a large pipeline of projects. But governments have to ensure that the permits are given swiftly, and connections to the grid to be granted. But we need to boost the system integration of renewable energy to ensure that rapid deployments is safely integrated and they're not curtailed. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Damori-san. It's very concise but very profound, setting the stage for our panel to proceed. Thank you again. I'd like to move on to introduce our panelists, very distinguished panelists. We have 4 panelists that is going to give their remarks. They are in the following order. The first panel will speak is Dr. Ajay Mathur. He is the Director General of the International Solar Alliance, or ISA, followed by Ms. Gauri Singh. She is the Deputy Director General of IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, followed by Mr. Daniel Wetzel. He is the head of the Tracking Sustainable Transitions Unit of the International Energy Agency. And last but not least is Mr. Christoph van Ack, the Director of Energy Dialogue of the International Energy Forum. Without further ado, I would like to ask Mr. Dr. Ajay Mathur, the platform is yours. Please.
Thank you.
Everyone will actually give about 5 minutes within the frame of 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My friend of many years, Sadamori-san, Dr. Pravirat Madhya, it's such a pleasure to be with you, colleagues on the panel, and those who are in the workshop. First of all, it's a huge pleasure to join all of you in this workshop on energy security put together by the G20 presidency of Indonesia and the International Energy Alliance. I want to thank them for including me and the International Solar Alliance in this discussion. I would like to focus on 4 key points. And let me first say what these 4 points are. The first is that energy markets are inherently volatile and that climate change often has a negative impact on fluctuations. This can be questionable, but I'll try to talk about it in more detail. The second is that energy efficiency can reduce the impacts of volatility. And the presence of DSM interventions in the energy arsenal of countries and geographies can enable rapid response to supply fluctuations. There's a second point. The third point is that renewable energy solutions, and particularly the energy storage systems that are part of renewable energy solutions are very effective tools in hedging the fluctuations that we see in the global energy market. And the fourth point that I'd like to make is that as the world settles down with its renewable energy powered grids and energy systems, the next generation of energy markets will be based on intercontinental transmission networks, which will have, therefore, issues on their own right. Let me spend a few moments on each one of these. The first point is that energy markets are volatile. We know that prices of gas or LNG change dramatically in response to demand, but also in response to supply-based constraints, as we are seeing right now. And very often that climate change, either in the form of floods or in the form of cold spells or in the form of heat waves, has, when combined with those price fluctuations, has often an impact on influencing the reliability of supply. I only need to look at the, about a year ago, in early 2021, there was a cold spell in the Japan, China, South Korea area, which led to LNG prices hitting all-time high and the supplies being disrupted. Similarly, we saw around this time last year, in February last year, the cold storm, the winter storm in Texas, which influenced the demand for electricity and natural gas. There was a huge influx in demand, and that led to rolling power cuts as the weather hit the Texas gas production and exports. Similarly, we saw low wind speeds have impacted wind energy production. We have seen how severe droughts in South America in late last year caused energy shortages in Brazil and Argentina and Chile, where hydropower plays a key role in energy stability. The short point is that while global energy markets, coupled with seamless logistic networks, have been a major boon over past decades, they can also be a bane at times. That's the first point. The second was that energy efficiency can reduce the volatility. That's a given. If the total demand is less, obviously, if there are impacts on supply, they are that much less. Those countries are that much less vulnerable if there is a great deal of energy efficiency. But the second part is that if the country has DSM instruments in its quiver, in its arsenal of energy tools, this can help greatly. So, for example, when there are shortages in energy supply, one can move in with the kinds of DSM mechanisms which enable the power supply to be reduced by 5%, 10%, depending on what is the kind of impact there is. But the point is, readiness is important. This is where we are. Let's look at the future. One of the things that we are seeing as the world puts in more and more renewables is that if we want to move to a 24-hour system, a 24-hour system based on renewables, energy storage is key. And the presence of local energy storage, therefore, insulates the system from external variations in supply. Because wind and solar are inherently volatile. So is hydro, as we have seen. And therefore, adding energy storage in the system, which is done for purposes of enhancing reliability when you have wind and solar, is also an energy security cover in times of stress in international supplies of energy. And finally, the point that I'd like to leave with is that as we look to the future and we are looking at renewable energy systems, there is obviously energy storage. But what will happen is that we will start seeing optimizations in countries regarding how much renewables you have, how much energy storage you have, and how much is the electricity that we import from other countries. Hence, intercontinental transmission lines of the type which is proposed in the Green Grids Initiative and the One Sun, One World, One Grid Initiative would help in addressing. The point that I'd like to leave you with is that volatility is here and we are seeing this increase. We are also seeing that each one of us, each country is becoming more vulnerable to volatilities, both internal volatilities, climate volatilities, and international supply volatilities. However, with energy efficiency and energy storage, and in the future, intercontinental transmission lines, we do have options on how we can manage these security concerns in the years to come. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mathur. Thank you. Let's move on to Ms. Gauri Singh. The platform is yours. Please give your remarks within
Thank
5
you.
minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Praveer Atmaja, and it's a pleasure. Thank you, Dr. Praveer Atmaja, and it's a pleasure to be able to contribute to this important conversation along with the other esteemed speakers and panelists. Governments today, we know, are facing this daunting task of tackling seemingly opposing agendas of energy security, resilience, and affordable energy for all. But these can't be dealt in silos, and nor can we have a short-term perspective without considering its implications on the medium and long-term development and climate challenges. Today, we are speaking at a time of high energy prices, but we would recall just some 2 years ago, we also saw negative oil prices. So the risk of tying economies with volatile oil and gas markets is very high, especially when you consider that almost 80% of the global population lives in countries that are net energy importers. And this volatility cannot be a reasonable foundation for sound economic strategies, we all know. But what it can definitely be is it can provide the basis for strengthening the resolve for countries to take up investments in energy efficiency and renewables to reconcile multiple agendas. Now, managing the energy transitions is not going to be easy, and we all know that. And IRENA has just released its annual World Energy Transitions Outlook last month, where we focused on what really needs to be done in this decade by 2030 to be able to navigate the compounding crisis that we are facing. And IRENA has always, approached the energy sector and the renewables specifically in a holistic way, because we know that this is important if energy transition has to maximize benefits and also minimize the adverse impact on people and economies. So, for instance, at IRENA, we've been tracking renewables job creation since 2012. And we've seen the benefits very clearly. We've seen these numbers more than double in the last decade to 11.5 million jobs in 2020. And the latest outlook, in fact, says that even in this decade, in this current decade, if we prioritize efficiency and renewables, this would not just boost the global GDP, but also create 85 million energy transition related jobs. So I just want to say that, investment decisions, as you all know, have long-term consequences, and more so in the energy infrastructure space. And what needs to be very carefully considered is that the decarbonized global economy that we are moving towards is going to be very different from what currently makes sense. Significant electrification of end use will reshape the demand. On the supply side, the solutions that are emerging, such as renewable hydrogen production, will have a large impact on the energy landscape. So while there will be complex challenges that developing emerging economies and developing countries will have to face, but the good news is that there are also viable solutions that exist for them to lead with future-oriented green industrialization based on modern and efficient renewable technologies. But in the end, as we all know, it will be the political will and resolve that will shape the transition path and will determine if we are moving towards a more inclusive, equitable, and stable world. There are difficult choices that will need to be made, and these will be made under significant pressure. And in the face of uncertainty, I think policymakers must be guided by the overarching goals of climate change and sustainable development. So let me end here, and I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ms. Gauri Singh, for excellent interventions. And we'd like to move on to Mr. Daniel Wetzel. Mr. Wetzel, the platform is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Today I'm going to be sharing you some slides, if we can get those up, for some brief remarks. The Italian G20 presidency kindly supported the IEA in tracking sustainable recoveries, in which the IEA looked at recovery plans globally to understand how much of what governments were mobilizing was going to clean transport, renewable power, grids investment, energy efficiency, and innovative energy technologies such as hydrogen, CCUS. And all of these investments not only help us reduce emissions and clean our energy systems, but also contribute to improving the energy security and reducing fuel exposure of many countries as well. This also includes looking at energy access and affordability measures in developing economies. What we have tracked thus far is that around $710 billion US dollars has been mobilized since the beginning of the pandemic, when we started tracking sustainable recoveries. This would make this recovery effort the having the largest allocation towards clean energy of any fiscal period in history. So 40% more than the amount of green spending allocated after the global financial crisis between 2008 and 2010. While we were looking at this, the critical period that we wanted to assess was over the next 3 years. And we estimate that around 60% of this 710 billion would be available and is earmarked for the next 3 years and is able to be spent in the real economy over that time period. We have tried to compare this total to how much would be needed in the short term to help the world shift tracks from sort of a business as usual case to the net zero scenario that the IEA put out last year, which describes the energy system globally reaching net zero by 2050. Next slide, please. And what we see is that with the current fiscal efforts, advanced economies are nearing the amount of government spending we anticipated would be needed for this shift in tracks, so good news there. But unfortunately, in EMDEs, where many countries face much more limited fiscal leeway, have only been able to mobilize around 25% of this total as they redirect more of their fiscal latitude towards ensuring affordability and helping their economies weather the impacts of both the COVID-19 pandemic and the current commodity price spikes. This highlights more than ever the need for international finance to help catalyze increased spending on decarbonizing efforts as well as energy security efforts in emerging and developing economies. Additional to this, the IEA has been tracking the amount of money going towards ensuring affordability during the current price spikes. Since the beginning of the winter heating season in the Northern Hemisphere of this year, we've tracked roughly 280 billion has been spent to help shore up affordability across global economies, and the vast majority of this is in advanced economies. And while we maintain that near-term affordability measures are warranted in this context, without an eye for longer-term investments to help decouple energy use from global imports, we would see this exposure and the risk of high prices and having energy be unaffordable continue in the future. And we will continue to track how spending will be mobilized to many of these categories that are both helping with the decarbonizing effort as well as also helping improve energy security going forward. To date, we've tracked around 1,000 different policies that are mobilizing spending to this space, and we will transition our tracker to continue to look at government spending more broadly and how it is funneled into these categories. Thank you for your time.
Great insights that you share, Mr. Wetzel. Thank you for that, and we'd like to move on. I would like to welcome Mr. Christophe van Ack to give your address within 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and greetings from Riyadh, where the sun is always out. And thank you for... Yes, thank you very much again. Greetings from Riyadh, where the sun is always out. And thank you for inviting the International Energy Forum to this timely G20 workshop, where we will give our perspective on maintaining energy security during the transition. It is indeed a privilege for the IF to work with the G20 presidency of Indonesia, and of course our partner organizations such as the IEA and IRENA represented here on energy security issues and prospects for greater sustainability and inclusivity. As the hosts already noted, threats to energy security and people-centered transitions have reached alarming levels. The solidarity with which the world overcame the pandemic, inspiring climate and energy ministers to collaborate, including by adopting the G20 Naples Energy Collaboration Principles, and step up their ambition for at the Glasgow Climate Conference, today is at risk of losing out. The IEF was established in 1991 after Iraq's invasion of Kuwait brought producers and consumers together to strengthen collaboration on their shared long-term interests in energy security and sustainable growth. And indeed, G20 leaders were prescient when they called for enhanced collaboration with the IEF at their last meeting in Rome to bolster energy security while countries transition towards full energy access and net zero greenhouse gas emissions. In addition to transitions, global energy markets face an historic realignment as immediate policy and energy market responses to Russia's invasion of Ukraine show. Energy markets must shift when balances and supply chains are fragile and infrastructure capacities still insufficient to have yet to be developed. This is while steel and other input prices have more than doubled, and as lockdowns in China announce, supply chain problems will endure. The world faced a rapidly building crisis already after demand returned to 99% of pre-COVID levels today, but investment in supply lagged on the growing risks and volatility that cloud investment horizons and chills market confidence. So the call on governments to maintain energy security and transitions while demonstrating they act in the public interest has never been higher. So to accommodate this historic realignment in a tight market without unduly harming energy security and transition goals, producers and consumers must broaden the solution space. Focus must shift to governance of energy markets themselves. Here, the IEF calculated that more than $500 billion will have to be invested per year to 2030 for oil and gas markets to keep up with demand. The entire energy sector will need more than double that amount to return to sustainable growth and reach shared goals this decade. So consumers are meanwhile exposed to an unsustainable price shock. Energy poverty is rising, not only in the non-OECD region, but in Europe and the wider OECD region as well. And of course, that pain is felt today as cascading effects ripple through the energy system. Though temporary and targeted measures to shield consumers should provide relief, measures to project market power should not add to market distortions or create new barriers to energy investment and trade. More clarity, therefore, and new energy policy guidance is needed for a step change in energy sector clean technology and cross-border infrastructure investment that will diversify sources and flows to bolster energy security and accelerate transitions without fanning inflation. Energy commodity price spikes and supply chain problems have pushed inflation to new record highs in April, and pressure on central banks to protect savings and act on the cost of living crisis with assertive interest rate hikes risks restraining the global economic recovery. Since world demand was already recovering maybe too fast for energy and commodity markets to follow, this may help to calm markets and keep prospects for just and orderly transitions open. Reports from the IMF spring meetings and other institutions are sobering and show a significant slowdown in GDP growth on account of rising government debt and the cascading effects of conflict. So to navigate the new risk environment, producers and consumers should, among others, ease gas infrastructure bottlenecks, such as between France and Spain, the Baltics, and Southeast Europe, while enhancing engagement in Eastern Mediterranean, North American, and African producers that are equally beset by poor regional energy market integration. The European Union, for instance, cannot just buy the additional LNG it requires, but it will have to create new supply sources itself. Furthermore, governments should accelerate CCUS and hydrogen deployment to mitigate slower coal to gas switching in Europe and Asia, and accelerate the advancement of clean technology and infrastructure investment, while of course expanding investment in renewables, including in biomethane development and other solutions. Finally, but very importantly, there is probably a need to reconsider sovereign investment guarantees and bank lending ratios to stimulate oil and gas sector investments and reevaluate the role of nuclear, of course. So here, indeed, we probably need a broader concept of ESG criteria that take a more holistic and practical approach. So to sum up, more international engagement, not less, will diversify energy trade and investment across countries and enhance substitution in global supply chains. More investment in diversification across the full technology and innovation spectrum, including oil and gas and mining, not less, will restore energy security and accelerate transitions we all want. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Van Ack. It's very for the great remarks. I would like to move on to some discussions among the panelists. For the first question, I would like to welcome the response from all panelists, and you might understand if the question is something related to the pandemic of COVID-19 pandemic, where everybody seems to have would like to understand how is the interactions between the current energy market dynamics and the COVID-19 pandemic will interact it to shape the global energy going forward. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Mathur. Perhaps you could start your intervention.
Sure. You know, one of the things that has happened, particularly in the energy markets and more specifically in the renewable energy markets, is the impact that we have seen of the supply of materials. That has been most affected by the pandemic. Now, what has happened is that there has been an inertia in the system, and so as soon as the pandemic reduced, the inertia was able to move ahead. But now we are again seeing that because of the Ukraine conflict, we are again seeing supply chains of products being affected. And that in turn is again leading to energy markets having a short supply. So I think we have had this multiplicity of challenges, of crises at the same time and often following each other. That becomes difficult for the market to handle.
Thank you. Ms. Gauri Singh, anything you would like to add?
Just taking it forward from what Dr. Mathur just said, you know, it's the Ukraine crisis in many ways is another reminder of the cost for economies which are dependent on fossil fuels. But luckily, we're seeing policymakers making that shift to scaling up renewables and towards enhanced energy efficiency. You know, it's been demonstrated by the response that we've seen in Europe coming from the current energy security situation. But what we think is going to be very important is also the decarbonization of the end users is really the next frontier. And that would lead to higher demand coming from renewables, for which public policy will be a very critical enabler. We've seen this in the way the cost for wind and solar have come down, and you know, all of us are aware of the very critical role that public policy played. So you know, this is a area which is emerging, which will probably give strength to countries taking a decision on increasing deployment for renewables, because the end use sectors are now coming in the game.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Mr. Wetzel, anything you would like to add?
Yes, thank you. What we're seeing from a government spending perspective is that it's very likely that the current fiscal period will be set to extend, with more governments taking similar interventions that they did in the pandemic under the current price spikes as well. Already, we're seeing some governments who had elements that they had tabled previously of their sustainable recovery plans coming back on the table. So more investment in renewables, energy efficiency, to be able to advance those agendas in the coming months as well. Additionally, many of them are extending some of the affordability protections that were already in place or had been set up and using those facilities to continue to ensure affordability. This is both domestically and also looking at international multilateral development banks providing some of that assistance going forward to different projects as EMDEs increasingly face less fiscal latitude and are bumping up against debt limits going forward. And then finally, what we're also seeing is that many policies, both of these crises have reminded us of how interconnected our supply chains are globally, and where those vulnerabilities may exist. And we're seeing many countries introducing new policies that are trying to build up local supply chains or diversify their supply chains, and use some of these fiscal investments to advance that agenda as well. So we'll continue sort of watching this space, but this is what we're seeing initially under discussion, and where new government spending may be directed in light of the current crisis.
Thank you. That's actually quite encouraging. Mr. Van Aal, you would like to add something on this particular question?
Yes, certainly. I would like to just build on what the other panelists have contributed. And indeed, while we're still on the long tail of the global pandemic, Russia's invasion of the Ukraine has certainly dealt a severe blow to G20 aspirations to recover stronger together and share prosperity better on a more livable planet. In addition to more spending on renewables, which we of course embrace and welcome, I think we need more tools to address the current crisis. What I found very hopeful is indeed that the latest IPCC report really recognizes the role of carbon capture, use and storage in order to keep us within the guardrails of the emission reductions required. No doubt, this realignment in energy markets that I refer to will mean that we will enter a somewhat more carbon-intensive period, and therefore investment in carbon capture, utilization and storage technologies and similar carbon management technologies, for instance, as conceptualized in the circular carbon economy, are of utmost importance. And we are looking at this very closely, and we really welcome the findings of the latest IPCC report in that respect. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Maybe I can continue with Mr. Van Aal for the questions on the cooperations generally. So you actually stress about that this issue for cooperation among nations and so on, right? I understand that your respective institutions for all the panelists include many, many countries, but in the case of you, in the International Energy Forum, actually you are facilitating the dialogue between IEA and OPEC, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct.
And then how would you see the cooperation that's ongoing between the two organizations?
Well, thank you very much for that question. Indeed, the IEF has 71 member countries, producers and consumers, IEA members and OPEC members, but also non-aligned members such as Russia, China, Iran, South Africa, and others. So indeed, IEA and OPEC and producer-consumer collaboration is probably now more important than ever before. Our collaboration with the IEA and OPEC in the context of the trilateral work program has gone from strength to strength. We have just concluded our International Outlook Symposium in February to indeed assess the investment environment and the various outlooks. And we are also collaborating on data issues. And of course, data in any crisis is the first go-to need. And we are hopeful that we will further make progress in that area. One of the issues that we are looking at is, of course, the comparability of historical baselines. We would like to understand better what the discrepancies are. It is not so much to align projections that may differ, but we do want to have a good scientific base, if I may, to ensure that we are comparing apples to apples. And that is, of course, in the interest of energy market stability. A big issue here, of course, remains the transparency in the area of non-OECD inventories. That is something that we are continuing to push for, also in the context of the Joint Organizations Data Initiative.
Thank you. If I can move on to Mr. Wetzel. Recently, the IEA has undertaken two collective actions. Can you actually explain it a little bit and how it actually foster further cooperations among nations in addressing the volatility and these energy crisis situations?
Let me take the question because
Oh,
that
sorry.
is what I'm in charge.
I don't know
No,
if
no,
Sadamari-san still available. Sorry, thank you so
yeah,
much.
of course. And well, first of all, thank you for the very good question. And of course, the IEA did two emergency stock releases, the fourth and fifth of the IEA history, with 62.7 and 120. And also, there will be additional USSPR coming to the market. But we need to bear in mind that this is only to fill the gap. So this will provide comfort to the oil market, which is in a very tight situation, even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But in order to ensure the kind of a stable the oil market in the coming months and years, we would need the international cooperation. So I fully agree with Mr. Van Acht that the international cooperation is all the more needed. And so it's not. So first of all, it would we would call for the producers for the kind of additional more supply to respond to the demand. And also on the consumer side, there will be additional efforts needed for the efficiency and also the diversification of the energy sources in order to free up the kind of a limited amount of oil for those who really need it. And this is not only oil, but also natural gas. In particular, we are in a very tight the gas market situation here in Europe, but also the Asian spot prices are very high. And therefore, we consider that the more supplies of the global LNG, thanks to the kind of a more liquid and the flexible nature of global energy markets, but also we need more diversification of the use of all energy technologies, including nuclear and also the renewables, to free up the LNG for the countries that really need it. So in that respect, we consider that the international cooperation and efforts, both by the consumers and producer side, but also in terms of the supply and demand. So we are ready to work with member and non-member countries in promoting this kind of international cooperation. But thank you.
Thank you so much, Sadamari-san. I'd like to squeeze one more questions that, if possible, I'd like to welcome all panelists to give their thoughts on this. This is very important. How can we make sure energy transitions are not sidelined by the current energy market turmoil? And how can energy transitions assist in ensuring our energy security? Maybe start with Ms. Singh.
Thank you so much. No, it's very critical that we realize that with the current crisis, what has happened is that we are seeing a strengthening of resolve coming from countries and policymakers to move for more deployment of and scaling up of renewables and also increased focus on energy efficiency. Now, we all understand that it's at crisis points like this that governments and countries go back to the drawing board and look at how they want to shape the policies for the future. So we think that it's important to strengthen international collaboration so that countries can not just share best practices around policies, but also share their failures on which policies worked and which didn't, because that is also very critical and important to set the path for countries which are taking up such a complex transition for energy.
Thank you so much, Ms. Singh. Dr. Mathur, would you like to add your thoughts on this?
I think the key challenge lies in using this as an opportunity. Ms. Gauri Singh very rightly pointed out that this is a good time to look at policies. It's also a good time for a variety of reasons, including the fact that people are hurting, to start investing in renewable energy far quicker than we have done in the past. And this is, in a sense, important because the time for renewable energy to come into the market is far shorter than it is for almost any fossil fuel-based option. Consequently, what it helps is that we can enable a larger amount of supply, enhance reliability, and at the same time meet people's needs, because that, I think, is the most important issue we have on the table. I believe, therefore, that the energy transition has a huge opportunity that can be utilized right now.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Mr. Wetzel, anything you would like to add, especially with the energy transition track that you are actually monitoring?
Yes, I think we obviously supply side measures play an important role in the short term, but as we said, beyond the maintaining of near-term affordability, having a long-term strategy that helps reduce energy energy import exposure and exposure to energy markets is important to be able to make this transition. And we're seeing many countries, including those measures on the table. And what was in the IEA's 10-point plans for oil and gas focus a lot on demand side measures, and many of those line up with what we are tracking in the Sustainable Recovery Tracker. So I think, if anything, this is an opportunity that many of those agendas are being advanced with more earnest, and looking for what opportunities there are in the short term to mobilize those. And so one other thing that we echo strongly is that the removal of red tape, leveraging and expanding existing programs, and being able to make sure you enhance your interfaces with consumers to help them easily access many of the incentives that will help move energy efficiency and electrification faster. Those all need to be improved in order for this to be a near-term solution and not something 3-5 years down the road. So governments need to not only look at putting the money in these categories and directing it there, but also how do we make sure that this flows effectively and quickly into markets. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Van Aert, anything you would like to add?
Yes, I would actually. I think I would like to emphasize the point that the transitions are also meant to be just and inclusive. And I would like to point at the fact that today approximately 2.5 billion people live in countries where food and fuel imports combined are 30% or more of total imports. In developing nations, recent progress in electricity access risks coming undone because of higher prices we see today. Between 2010 and 2019, approximately 1.1 billion people gained access to electricity for the first time, mainly in sub-Saharan Africa, Oceania, and Central and Southern Asia. However, the UN warns that the combination of COVID-19 and higher energy prices may render all of this progress undone. And that is something that we should very closely watch. So the question here is really, electrification alone is not the only solution. We also need clean molecules, and we need, in order to achieve that, new technologies and more investment in RD&D to make sure that we also deliver on our energy access and affordability goals.
Thank you. I'd like to invite Sadamori-san, last but not least, for your final thought on these last questions.
As we made clear in the last year's the Security of Clean Energy Transitions report, we consider that the accelerating clean energy transitions is the key in terms of ensuring the energy security in the long term. And we even reaffirm this belief under the current conditions with a very difficult the energy situation coming from the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So as all speakers say, the accelerating rather than slowing down the clean energy transitions is always the key. But in order to ensure the kind of the understanding of the public to these energy transitions, we need to make sure that we need to make sure that the energy can be supplied in a secure, stable, and affordable manner in the short term as well. So in that respect, we need to work on both the supply security of traditional energy sources in the short term, while trying to ensure the transition to the low carbon future. So we need to work on both at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's actually a very good sum up of what we've discussed. All this coming from you, Sadamori-san, and all the panelists. By no means that what all the nations facing in terms of maintaining energy security during this energy transitions is easy, especially with the current situations, with the volatility of the geopolitics, pandemic, and so on, that each country will have to deal with the right policy, but more importantly, that it has to be supported also with the cooperation among nations. And I think that is the importance of why G20 is actually one of the grouping of nations that would probably support the goals that we actually discussed today in terms of maintaining energy security during the energy transition. With that, I would like to end because we don't have much time. I would like to personally thank all the speaker and panelists. And of course, I'd like also to thank the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources and the International Energy Agency for having me to facilitate the discussions. I'll return back this to MC. Thank you so much. Assalamualaikum.
Thank you, Pak Wawan. Thank you to all the panelists for a fruitful discussion. Give a round virtual applause for the panel one, everyone. Terima kasih, Bapak. Distinguished participants, we are moving to the next panel discussion. We have Mr. Tim Gold, the Chief of Energy Economist of IEA, to be the moderator of the second panel. Mr. Tim Gold, you may lead the session.
Thank you very much indeed for those introductory words, and thank you very much to our Indonesian friends and colleagues for the collaboration with today's event. An excellent panel that has set the scene then for this second round of discussion on a range of issues around energy security. What I took from the discussion just now is, I mean, we heard about the downside of higher fuel prices, the inflationary pressures that we're facing, the hit that is being taken to near-term growth, as we heard with the latest IMF numbers. But we also had this sense of an opportunity, that this crisis could be a spur to innovation, that it could accelerate the deployment of technologies that can tackle energy security vulnerabilities, but also tackle emissions. But in all of that, investors will be looking for strong guidance from governments, and that's why it's a great pleasure for me to have such an authoritative and excellent panel. And also, it's a great pleasure just to say a couple of introductory words that would share a perspective on some of these issues from the IEA. And perhaps if we could get my slides on the screen, I could just use those to make a few introductory points. I don't think it's inevitable that energy transitions are going to be disjointed or disrupted by events, but there are some things that make volatility more likely. And one of the key considerations there is this question of investment. And I'm not sure if it's possible to look at the slides, but if we look at the current situation, the flows of capital into different parts of the energy economy, it is a worrying picture. Because if you look at, in a sense, the traditional part of the energy economy, fossil fuel investment, oil and gas upstream investment, it's roughly half of what it was 7 years ago. But of course, oil and gas demand has not come down by anything like that amount. And if you look on the other side of the ledger, if you look at the amount of money that is going into clean energy transitions, and that is much more robust, it's around $1 trillion each year. But it would need to be much higher in order for us to meet rising demand for energy services in a sustainable way. And for as long as we have this mismatch in terms of investment flows, that is a risk that we will see disjointed transitions. And this would be illustrated if we move on to my next slide. You see that mismatch on the screen between the levels of money going into oil and gas production versus the shortfall that we have on the clean energy side. In our view, the way forward is very clear. We need to boost quickly the amount that's being spent on transition. So boost what you're looking at on the right-hand side of the screen. And on the next slide, I would like to make it clear that the task is more nuanced than just building clean. If you look at the sorts of things that need to happen over the next 10 years, only a relatively small part of that task is about immediately investing in zero emissions sources of energy. There's also a huge kind of middle ground that allow us to make existing energy facilities cleaner, or they are partial steps on the road towards a net zero emission system. For instance, when we buy an electric car, that is not a zero emission source of energy. It's potentially a zero emission source of energy, but only once we've cleaned up the power sector. Likewise, for all sorts of investments in efficiency. And this is a tricky finding for those seeking to align financial flows with net zero goals. So the idea that all energy in sector investments divide neatly into sort of clean investments and dirty investments, that idea really doesn't survive contact with the reality of the energy system and with the realities of energy transition. So it's vital that we keep adequate financial channels open for a range of projects that deliver genuine emissions reductions, but without this then becoming a loophole for business as usual or for greenwashing. On the next slide, I'd like to just take a look at this from a consumer perspective, because one of the big tasks facing policymakers is how can they best shield consumers from the implications of energy market or fuel price volatility. And what we show in some work we did in our most recent World Energy Outlook is that transitions, the sorts of investments that take place in energy transitions, provide a very effective shelter for consumers, because buildings are more efficient, because appliances are more efficient, mobility is more electrified, in some cases heating is more electrified, and oil and gas prices in well-managed transitions are also lower. But a key point is that those benefits don't come for free. They require a range of upfront investments, and governments also need to step in to help households, particularly more vulnerable households, make some of those upfront investments that then provide some shelter from future fuel price volatility. On my next slide, I would like to say a couple of words about electricity security, because electricity really moves to the heart of the energy system and to the heart of the discussion around energy security as we move forward. That means, of course, that electricity disruptions become even more costly to economies, and that means we need to focus very much on resilience to climate-related impacts and to cyber attacks. But there are security benefits as well as economies become more reliant on domestic sources of energy and less reliant on imported fuels. And the key element that I wanted to highlight on this slide is the importance of flexibility. So we really need a range of measures that can ensure flexibility, adequacy, and reliability at all times, because we know that both on the supply side of the electricity system and on the demand side, that variability is going to increase over time. And we will lose one of the primary sources of flexibility that we have today, which is the existing fossil fuel generation. And so scaling up investment and offering incentives to scale up investment in all sorts of demand response, robust grids, hydrogen-based solutions, and of course, batteries and other elements of flexibility is going to be absolutely essential. My next slide looks at another emerging aspect of energy security, which is very much part of the discussion today, and I'm sure we'll touch upon it with our great panel, and that's around the importance of the critical minerals that go in today's clean energy technologies. So what you can see on the screen is how over the last 10 years, the cost of batteries has come down very sharply. There's been a wave of innovation there, but what that also means is that the raw material component in battery costs has risen quite sharply. And so higher and more volatile mineral prices could therefore have a significant effect on the overall cost of transforming our energy system. And we need to be very aware here of strong geographical concentration along different parts of the supply chain. And the commodity price rises that we've seen over the last few months illustrate the strains that we could expect if those kinds of cost pressures are maintained over the long term. We believe strongly at IEA that these risks can be mitigated, but they will require a dedicated effort by governments. We are very engaged on that topic and indeed received a very strong new mandate from our member countries to look more at these issues during our recent IEA ministerial. But the response from policymakers will determine whether critical minerals become a key enabler for transitions or whether they become a bottleneck in the process. And my final slide just illustrates some aspects of that changing energy system by looking at the value of international trade in energy in different scenarios. For the moment, as you can see in the numbers for 2019, the value of international energy trade dominated by oil. But you'll notice that critical minerals are already appearing as an important part of that picture. And that, for the moment, that's mostly the copper that goes into electricity grids and other electrical applications. But rising demand, as we're all aware, for lithium, nickel, cobalt, and rare earths. And as you move through transitions, in the middle, you're looking at what would the situation be like in 2050 if governments did all the things that they say they were going to do. And oil is still very important there, but you see some new elements in the picture emerging, particularly the importance of trade in hydrogen and hydrogen-rich fuels. And when we reach a net zero emission system, as we do in 2050 in that net zero scenario, the current dynamics of international trade in energy are completely overturned. So we need to watch very closely for those changes in energy trade as we move through transitions, the trade patterns, producer policies, geopolitical considerations, they continue to be of crucial importance, even as we shift towards a more electrified, renewables-rich energy system. So those would be my opening remarks. I think my key message here is that we need to look very seriously at investments in energy efficiency, not as a separate discussion to the discussion around climate change, but as an integral part of that transformation. As we're all aware, we will not get a rapid transition unless it's also a secure and reliable one. And resilient systems, they don't come for free. You need all sorts of risk mitigation strategies and mechanisms. You need buffers, you need backups, you need storage, but you also need foresight. And that's why I'm delighted now to pass on to our excellent panel for their thoughts on this topic. And I would like to start with our colleague, Mr. Kobayashi, who is from the Deputy Commissioner for International Affairs, the Agency for Natural Resources and Energy at METI in Japan. and I look forward to hearing his reflections on these issues.
Well, thank you, Tim, for the very kind introduction, and we always appreciate the contribution of IEA to improving global energy security, and I feel very much honored to join this panel with other esteemed speakers and panelists. I also appreciate the ESDM of Indonesia for holding this webinar and your enormous efforts and hospitality for the G20 presidency. Japan announced to aim for the carbon neutrality in 2050, and its NDC is 46% emission reduction in 2030 from 2013 level. And the sixth strategic energy plan, which is consistent with these ambitious targets, and includes the 2030 electricity mix, was approved by the cabinet last October. Today, I'd like to explain a little bit about this plan, and is it possible to share my presentation slides? Thank you. Next, please. Okay. In this plan, basically the maximizing the efforts to introduce the renewables and to promote the energy efficiency were the prerequisites. And as you can see from the chart, the left-hand side one is the electricity mix in fiscal year 2019, and right-hand one is the 2030. And as you can see from the chart, we basically expect about 10% reduction of electricity demand in 2030 compared to 2019, with 30 to 38% of electricity is from renewables. The expected share of nuclear is about 20 to 22%, which is significantly larger than the 6% in 2019. And I would like to point that these efforts are important not only for reducing emissions but also for improving Japan's energy security. However, still we expect around the 40% of our electricity would come from fossil fuel even in 2030. Therefore, I would also like to stress the importance of traditional energy security measures such as oil stockpiling, diversification of resource sourcing countries, and increasing upstream investments. And they are not only important now, but also important in 2030 and even beyond. Next, please. Next slide, please. Okay. Let me touch on energy efficiency. And Japan has been working on energy efficiency in the last 50 years because we have very little domestic energy resources. There are two key legal frameworks for Japan to promote energy efficiency. The Act on Rational Use of Energy is targeting business operations, equipment, machineries, and appliances, and Act on Improvement of Energy Consumption, performance of buildings, is setting the energy efficiency standards for the buildings. One thing I would say is that the energy efficiency needs investments, as Tim pointed at the presentation, at his presentation, and it is actually more expensive to retrofit the energy efficient equipment and the machineries once the inefficient systems are installed I also would like to point that the increasing renewables could raise the cost of electricity in the next 10, 20 years if we really want to secure the stable electricity supply. However, we need to increase renewables to counter climate change, and fossil fuels can continuously be expensive as well. And therefore, I would like to stress the importance for the emerging countries of installing energy efficient system from the upfront. And next, please. Next slide. Okay. I also would like to stress the importance of nuclear among the proven available power generation technologies. Only nuclear, hydro, and to some extent, geothermal can provide sizable zero carbon electricity without intermittency. Japan experienced Fukushima Daiichi power plant accident, and all the reactors in Japan were once shut down. Now 10 reactors were restarted. Our priority at this moment is to continue our efforts to restart reactors with safety at the top priority. Next, please. And Japan is also committed to continue our efforts for the R&D of nuclear-related technologies. We simply cannot envisage further emission reduction beyond 2030 if we do not have advanced technology of nuclear. So almost all countries with nuclear are now trying to enhance their nuclear capacity. It would be important for countries like Indonesia even to consider introducing nuclear seriously. And if that is the case, perhaps Japan is happy to support the process. And thank you very much. That's all for my presentation.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Kobayashi. And I would now like to turn to our next speaker, who's Mr. Glenn Sweetnam, who's the Senior Vice President for the Asia Pacific Energy Research Center in Tokyo. And Glenn, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to participate in this workshop and very much enjoyed the presentations of the other presenters. I think one of the things I would like to emphasize that sometimes gets lost is that transitions are hard. Ms. Singh said it directly, but then talks with optimism about the transition. Tim, you mentioned how expensive it is and lots of money needs to be spent. We've been trying to do energy transitions ever since the 1970s when we had the import dependence on oil. And so we have 50 years of experience trying to implement energy transitions, and they are difficult, especially at scale. And so energy security is extremely important because if we want to create reliable energy supplies at a reasonable cost, that's really going to require us to have excess margin, excess supply margin. And that's what's so difficult to do. For example, Tim, you referred to retire dirty early. And I would say that part of our problem is trying to discourage supply before we discourage demand. In other words, even before we had the Russian-Ukraine crisis, we were seeing already that oil, gas, and coal prices were all increasing. And they were increasing because investors and governments were trying to discourage supply. But demand was not being discouraged. Demand was not being reduced. And so if you want to have a secure transition, I believe you need to have the switch in demand before you try and force the reduction in supply. And of course, there's going to be unanticipated problems and disruptions. You have equipment failures. You have natural disasters. You have weather, harsh weather. You have earthquakes. You have man-made disruptions. We have cybercrime or terrorist activity. The Colonial Pipeline in the United States is an example of that. So having a diversity of supply, not just of sources geographically, but of types of supply, and having reserve margins which allow the governments and the operators to respond rapidly, flexibly, and seamlessly is very important for maintaining that you have adequate supplies, reliable supplies at a reasonable cost. And this is where sort of it gets very difficult to do, because you are trying to make this transition while keeping costs reasonable. My good friend Deske Satamore sort of implied that renewables is less costly than the traditional fuels. But when we look at the economies that have increased significantly their reliance on renewables, their electricity costs are higher. They're higher than in regions that have not done that. And we need to understand why. I guess that's the other thing just about the cost. I think one of the issues that governments sometimes try to do is they're gonna try and minimize costs by worrying about stranded assets and trying to close down stranded assets. But when you close down these assets, you take away the flexibility you need when unexpected events occur. So with that then, I'll turn it back. But to me, the key issue here is that in the transition to maintain energy security, let's transition demand before you try and transition supply. Thank you.
There are some points that I would be delighted to come back on also during the discussion there, but I think you've made some very powerful arguments, which is certainly crucial to this debate. With that, I would like to move on to our next speaker, who is Mr. Dennis Messina from the U.S. Department of Energy. He is an international relations specialist in the Office of International Affairs at DOE, and I look forward very much to hearing Dennis's remarks.
Hey, Tim. Appreciate the introduction. Let me start at the outset by thanking everyone for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation and some very interesting panel contributions, both in the first panel and in this one as well. I'd like to touch on the topic of critical minerals, which I'm really glad to be to see as a part of this energy transition conversation. I think a lot of times the question of critical minerals gets left off or gets partitioned from the energy transition conversation. And I think those two things are very important to be linked together. In order to have a successful energy transition, I believe that energy security in the context of critical minerals is going to be vitally important in the decade to come. So when we talk about energy security in the context of critical minerals, I think we have to expand beyond our traditional understanding of diverse, secure, and resilient supplies, and also factor in time. And what I mean by time is understanding that we have demands that are going to be created by the need to deploy clean energy technology at scale, at this scale required to basically keep 1.5 degrees Celsius within reach. So to get there, I don't think there's a silver bullet. I think it'll take several distinct efforts. Some of them are underway now, and that's very promising. Others are going to need help to continue moving forward. And I'll touch just on a few of those here. I'll start at first with the idea of international cooperation in this space. Well, I recognize that these minerals are very frequently geographically concentrated. I think that the value chains for the distinct supply chains that the various minerals and metals that are required for the clean energy transition traverse are actually stand to benefit from contributions from many countries, not just where these minerals are, and also stand to be able to generate economic benefits for many countries, just not just where those minerals are concentrated. So I think there are opportunities to cooperate, and as I said before, in the context of the energy transition, I think there has to be a balance between that cooperation multilaterally, internationally, and also making sure that domestically governments take care of their domestic populations as well. I think, Tim, to your earlier point, we were obviously very pleased with the inclusion of critical minerals in the recent IEA mandates released after the ministerial, and we think that that's a model for how we can start thinking about international cooperation in the mineral space. The second piece that I would say is that we're optimistic that critical mineral value chains, both upstream all the way to downstream into manufacturing specifically, offer an incredible economic opportunity for people in the form of jobs, and it also creates, I think, to an earlier point, right, from our IEF colleague, an opportunity for an inclusive prosperity, creating new opportunities and new industries, in fact, for people that didn't previously have economic opportunities in the energy sector. So we look forward to being able to foster that and develop that further. The next piece I would say is also, I think, two parts of the same coin. That's going to be public spending. In the United States, the Department of Energy has been able to capitalize on the recent infrastructure law to begin making significant investments, both in grant money and in debt capital financing, to begin to mobilize and build capacity domestically within the United States. But we're also exploring the possibility of partnering with partners overseas to look at opportunities to, as I said before, to cooperate and expand supply chains. So on the government side, there is both outreach and spending that is being dedicated and is increasing to help begin the process of expanding capacity up and downstream. And I think the second piece, the other side of that coin, is going to be engagement with the private sector. We're not going to get there without the private sector. Not only their insight, but we also need their investment, their mobilization, and we need to be able to understand exactly where we can place big bets to get big returns. Because, as I said before, time is a factor. So the last piece I would say on going back to the government side is from an energy security standpoint, we recently came to an agreement with the Department of Defense and the Department of State to examine and explore a stockpiling program that would be dedicated to supporting the energy transition. This isn't a new program, the stockpiling program that is under the Department of Defense. It has been doing that for decades. The new aspect of it is that this would not be a program that was developed for military contingencies. This is a program that piece of the stockpile that would be dedicated to assessing the risk of the risks inherent to the energy transition. I think one of the things that COVID has taught us in recent times is that it's really that strategic surprise that can come up and pose a risk to our supply chains, the thing that you didn't expect, for want of a better phrase. And just given our timetables of 2030 and 2050, we have to hedge against any risk to our ability to deploy clean energy technology in the time that's required of us in order to meet our climate goals. And I guess the last piece that I would say on this topic is that when we talk about critical minerals and critical materials, I think very frequently it gets kind of lumped together as a monolithic issue, when in reality we're talking about supply chains and value chains that are very diverse by mineral and by metal, and each of them has their own distinct challenges, both economic, social, governance-wise, and it's important for us to be mindful of that. We are not going to, as our secretary said, going to trade one one environmental disaster for another. So as we move forward, our emphasis on ESG and making sure that we are responsibly sourcing and sustainably processing is going to be a key underpinning to the way we move forward in the mineral space. Thanks, appreciate it. That concludes my remarks.
Thank you so much, Dennis, for that valuable perspective on the challenges around the critical minerals. I'd now like to move on to our next speaker, Mr. Miguel Tetra, who's the head of Economic Analysis and Foresight at the European Commission's Directorate General for Energy, and a really key figure within the Commission for aligning some of these near-term energy security concerns with the European Union's longer-term climate goals. So, Miguel, I look forward to hearing your remarks.
Good morning, dear colleagues, and good morning, team. First of all, thanks a lot for inviting me to this, to this occasion and this very important event, which is on a very important issue these days, as you were mentioning, which is how we manage our transitions. I mean, we know in the European Union where we want to be in 2030, where we want to be in 2050. This has not changed with the prices developments since August of last year. It has not changed with the recent developments and the sad developments in Ukraine. But the question is how we get there. I mean, how are we going to be able to manage our transitions in a way that is going to be cost efficient, in a way that is going to be socially acceptable, and in a way that is going to deliver, let's say, early on the sustainable and the green side. Now, we need to manage our transitions, and we need to do it in a context of tight supply, as we are seeing these days, and an amazingly increasing demand in the world related to the sources of energy. Now, we need to be clear, and this is something that when I talk, myself with member states in the European Parliament and so on, I mean, sometimes it's still a bit, counterintuitive for some, but gas and oil will still play a role in 2030, even with the acceleration of our Green Deal, and we have a series of proposals, that are called Fit for 55 package, where we have, renewed targets for energy efficiency, for renewable energy, and so on. But still, in 2030,
gas and oil will still play a role in EU's energy mix, albeit a decreasing one. And in 2050, there's still a small part for gas and oil. Now, in managing the transition, the issue we have is that we need to balance, different trade-offs. We need, to ensure that we have affordable sources of energy, secure sources of energy, and at the same time that we are not endangering the sustainability and our sustainability objectives. Now, another important point is that managing the transition, as the previous speaker said, is not something which is easy. What we see, and I think that Tim was also making reference to that, is that episodes of volatility, because of abrupt adjustments in supply and demand, will probably become more and more regular. So we need in a sense to secure the access to those sources of energy that will be needed, as I said, to manage the transition. And it's difficult because we want to avoid stranded assets, we want to avoid the duplication of infrastructure and so on, and doing it in a way that we cushion the effects of these abrupt changes of demand, of supply, this volatility. Now, the current context of the war in Ukraine brought the European leaders to endorse our new strategy that we will present on the 18th of May. I mean, this is the date, and we are working on it, which is a strategy to reduce the dependence on Russian fossil fuels by 2027. So it adds another layer of complexity, to this equation of managing transition. Now, their timing is a very important element. When we proposed to the heads of state and government this repower strategy, we clearly outlined that in the short term, what you can do is to diversify the supply sources, and we are seeing it today with the development of the LNG market, to make it partly for the changes in the global gas market. But also there is the very important management of demand, because sometimes the discussion focuses too much on the supply side, but it's on the demand side where on the short term you can do let's say most things and support the adjustment. So this would be for the short term. From the short to the medium term, we need to accelerate our Green Deal objectives. I mean, I think that one important message from me is that the current environment, with high energy prices, with the supply constraints, is not putting into question the Green Deal. Ourselves, we did some modeling, and had we accelerated in the past years the Green Deal, we would have been much more resilient, and we would have cushioned part of the impact of the high energy prices. So in that sense, we need to accelerate the deployment of energy efficiency solutions and renewable energy sources. Renewable energy sources, I mean, they come with their benefits. They also, come with their limitations. But had we had more solar, onshore and offshore wind in Europe today, we would be much more cushioned for the global swings in the market. Now, in accelerating this, let's say, Green Deal investments, it is extremely important to pay attention also to the supply chains, because the availability of solar panels, of turbines, and so on, is very much limited these days, or because of the constraints on the supply chain. And at the same time, we need to do the homework ourselves in Europe very much, the main limitation for the deployment of renewable energy sources, for instance, lies on the permitting side. It is very complex to get the permitting from all different levels of administration in Europe. It might take even 2-3 years, to get all the permits in place to deploy an onshore wind park in Europe, and we need, to reduce very much this standard. We are now working alongside this package of Repower EU with some legal proposals to accelerate permitting in Europe, alongside with other elements of this legislative package. Some on the saving side, some on the solar side. But I think that this is, a very important element. So my conclusion is that it's going to be difficult in the next 10 years. It's going to be challenging because we still need, some sources of energy in a significant way. We need to work on managing the winding down and the reduction of these sources of energy, and this is not an easy task. And at the same time, we need to continue to accelerate these objectives of the Green Deal without creating new dependencies. And as it was said before, we have, raw materials and minerals. These are geographically, very concentrated, and it is very important that this is taken into account. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Miguel, for these very interesting remarks. And I think we're going to pick up on one of your last points about the importance of building up capacity along supply chains with our final speaker, who is Mr. Pakagos, is an advisor to the Minister of Energy and Mineral Resources, Indonesia, and focusing in particular on the acceleration of industrial development in these areas. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Tim. Good afternoon, everybody. Distinguished moderator, Pak Yudo, Prof. Tutuka, Mr. Keisuke, and the distinguished panelists and participants. I'm very pleased today together with you, and I would like to share Indonesian experience, lesson learned, and challenge toward the mentions of this topic of this second panel. Many panelists mentions about the supply and demand strategy. So that is the first of Indonesia thinks about that before we decide to go to do more detail in the strategy in an energy transition. So we are thinking to side about the first supply side strategy. Yeah, next. And also demand side strategy. So in the supply side strategy, we are going to develop in a massive way of new and renewable energy such as solar, hydro, geothermal, hydrogen, etc. And of course, we have to think very carefully about the provide energy access and equitable transition with touch of people living in undeveloped, remote, and outmost areas. Indonesia, blessed with 17,000 islands, is very big and huge area. So the problem is also very big. So this have to be think from the beginning by the government. In the demand side strategy, of course, we're maintaining supply for the growth of the national energy demand and utilizing new highly efficient equipment in saving the energy such as stove, battery electric vehicle, city gas, etc. Next. So the Indonesian government already took notable step on our national effort to accelerate energy transitions by promoting energy transition roadmap, which among others, additional power plant after 2030 will only come from new and renewable energy power plant. Starting 2035, it will be dominated by variable renewable energy in form of solar, followed by wind and ocean current in the following years. Hydrogen will be utilized gradually starting from 2031 and massively by 2051. Of course, Indonesia have wind, hydro to produce the hydrogen. And then nuclear power plant will enter the system in 2049. The CFPP capacity will increase until 2026. And after that, there is no plan to add more. And the last CFPP will end in 2056. So this roadmap is aimed in achieving net zero emission target by 2060 or sooner with international support. Next. So what is the implementations measures? The implementation program are created such as gradual retirement of coal-fired power plants, biomass co-firing for existing coal-fired power plants, conversion of diesel power plant to gas or local-based renewable energy, deployment of low-carbon technology such as CCS, increasing geothermal utilizations, build up supergrid interconnection. So as I told that we have 17,000 islands. So we have to think about how we interconnect each other. Increasing the NRE mixed through the use of NRE source for non-electricity and non-fossil. Accelerate the use of battery and electric stove, as I told before, and promote motorcycle conversion program. This is very unique for Indonesia. From internal combustion engine into electric motors. So that one specifically for gasoline motorbikes with age over 7 years. Currently, Indonesia has about 115 million motorcycles. So this is a very big issue for Indonesia. Next. So some measures are already been taken by the government. First is to strengthen current regulations and to create renewable energy conducive investment climate, such as stipulating rooftop solar PV regulation by using a net metering scheme, establishing presidential regulations on renewable energy tariff, which determine tariff competitively while still taking into account the fairness and the affordability aspect, issuing regulations on carbon economy, implementing carbon tax, and it will be starting by July 1st of this year, creating partnership with international community to enable faster technology transfers and mobilizing financial support to achieve NZ in 2060. And then the second that we have to keep in mind that the energy transition is carried out by Indonesia while maintaining national energy security within the corridor of energy security 4A, affordability, price, sources, fuel and non-fossil, availability, stock, and then mandatory for domestic and also buffer stock, accessibility, and acceptability. Next. So my concluding notes is the energy transition speed of each country will differ from country to country. Some countries have experienced the advantage of energy transition to stimulate sustainable economic growth. Others, including Indonesia, are still need support. The areas for international cooperation, such as provide and share clean energy technology to replace coal-based technology, promote investment in clean energy, and help other countries to phase out coal, addressing the socio-economic impact of the global energy transitions. So all the effort of Indonesia will contribute to 314 million tons of carbon CO2 equivalent for NDC in the energy sector by 2030. And then new general plan of electric supply 21 to 30 is more improved in a greener by allocating almost 52% share of renewable energy or equal to 20 or 21 gigawatt additional capacity. So thank you very much. That is our share, and thanks everybody.
Thank you so much, Bakagos, for those remarks. I would like to ask the indulgence of our organizers and also of our distinguished participants and take an additional 5 minutes to come back to each of our speakers with a quick question. Please keep your answer very short, and perhaps we can start with Mr. Kobayashi, because I understand that you have extensive experience also advising on international issues also in Southeast Asia. You know, when countries are drawing conclusions from the current energy security crisis, what advice would you give to sort of emerging and developing economies on how they can best tackle some of the issues that we've discussed today?
Well, thank you very much for the excellent question. I think the important thing is that the important thing is to be ready to take the possibility that the energy price might goes up, and the renewables sometimes said that the renewables are quite cheap, and it could be cheap. But when we want to have the very stable electricity supply, this could be very expensive. So that it's very important for the developing countries to secure their funding to make sure that they are able to be ready for upgrading their investment to be able to digest these relatively high energy costs. Thank you.
Mr. Kobayashi, maybe if I can turn to Glenn Sweetnam now. Certainly we have a perspective on the contribution of renewables to electricity costs. There are different examples. I'm not sure it's, I'd like to come back to you on that maybe on a separate occasion, but the question I have for you is around this distinction between the sort of supply-driven transitions versus demand-driven transitions, and you made the argument with which I sympathize that, you know, it's important that the demand side comes first, but we can't let the supply side off the hook. So what do responsible suppliers do to assist in that process, that necessary process of change?
Well,
sorry, I was muted there. Sorry.
Sorry, Glenn. Please,
Yeah.
do I need to repeat the question? Are you okay?
No, I heard the question. You didn't hear my response. So I think what's very important is, especially in terms of the middle income and lower income countries, which are going to have most of the growth in energy use. And so what the OECD does with respect to decarbonization is not as important as what happens in the developing countries. And in the developing countries, the cost of capital is high. And so there is this balance between these expensive or capital intensive, including energy efficiency, including solar, including wind, including nuclear, versus lower capital and higher operating costs. I think the key is, as we said, or as I said, is trying to increase the supplies, as Mr. Kobayashi said, of nuclear, for example, increasing the solar and wind. As you increase it, then the demand for the fossil fuels will decline. But if you try to restrict the fossil fuels, clearly sort of the methane capture and focusing on methane is a good way to clean up natural gas. But I think just allowing that or encouraging that to be produced efficiently and cleanly is going to allow the economies to be much more secure. So I'm sorry, I don't know if I've exactly answered your question, Tim, but maybe we continue the conversation later.
Yeah, exactly. No, but thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Glenn. I had a question for Dennis as well, because you spoke a lot about the balance between public action and private investment, also on the critical minerals side. So what do you think are the indispensable areas where governments need to step up?
Yeah, so I think one of the areas that government needs to step up is, I'm sorry, can you see me? I apologize.
Not sure if we can see you, but we can certainly hear you.
Fantastic. One of the areas that I think government can step up is in terms of action today, and also incentivizing action today in the industry. The challenge that we have is that we need to build capacity, and a lot of times when people are talking about capacity, they think upstream in terms of extraction, or they think midstream for processing. But it's really more than that, because in order to meet demand, we also have to build job skills. We need a workforce, not just in the United States, but around the world, in order to be able to do this work up and downstream. We need infrastructure that needs to happen. We need to start doing that now. So government is obviously the best positioned to make those bets. And I think that this year's infrastructure law was obviously, in the United States, a great first step towards moving in that direction, right? And then I would say, lastly, just to keep my response short, I think a recycling program in the mineral space or recycling programs are going to be absolutely vital, because as all of us know, it's going to take a while for us to build up supply to meet, as I said previously, the demand that's required of us by 2030 and 2050. In the near term, I think that we can put a dent into our supply shortfall for clean energy deployment by starting to think about comprehensively how we deploy recycling programs to basically, reuse and develop that circular economy that everybody keeps talking about, so that we can not only just, address the environmental concerns of old batteries, but also, shore up our, as I said, our near-term supply and diversify our sources.
Great, thank you so much, Dennis. A question for Miguel on the very interesting presentation that you made about the perspective from the European Commission. And you spoke about this trade-off between different elements of this. And I'd like to come back to this, what the expectations that we should have that this will be, this issue that the European Union has at the moment to move away rapidly from Russian coal, oil, gas. How much should we expect that solution is found on the supply side through alternative supplies? How much should we expect that the solution will be found on the demand side?
Thank you very much, Tim, for this question, because it's precisely the core of the work that we are doing these days. I mean, I think a very important point is the timing, because on the demand side, and this is as I said, part of what we will present on the 18th of May, there are going to be an EU savings plan, and on the short term defined, from now until the end of the year and probably next year, what we can do is mainly diversify supply, from different routes with unchanged infrastructure, and do something on the demand side. So I fear that the demand side on the short term is going to have much more importance than the building of capacity, which is much more of a medium term issue. I mean, it is difficult because on the one hand, citizens and governments, they don't want reduction of demand. I mean, there because of the economic activity, because of our living standards. I mean, it's so we need to be careful in designing these measures. From the point of view of the social acceptance, but there is no other way out. And I think that something that I liked, quite a lot from the session that we're having today is that I believe that most of us agree that in managing, this transition, we need to act both on the demand and on the supply side. So I would say, that probably, in the short term, half of the effort has to come, from the demand side, and a little bit less in the medium term. But there is also one point, that I feel it's very important. I mean, it's about the behavioral measures, that citizens and industries, can introduce to lower their consumption. Because if these measures, and the IEA yourself, team, you came with, the potential of lowering thermostats at home, also, the potential of, doing certain actions on the transport. If we keep, these behavioral measures over time, then the cost of what is needed, to be delivered on the supply side, with renewable energy sources or electrification, will also decrease. So I think it's a win-win to act on both. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miguel. And a final question to Bacagas, because you gave a very interesting overview of the Indonesian approach to this, and there are many, in a sense, common elements to the approaches taken in many other parts of the world. But you also mentioned some very distinctive aspects for Indonesia, particularly the topography, the number of islands, the archipelago nature of the country. What, in your view, are some of the really distinctive, or a couple of the really distinctive elements of this debate for Indonesia?
Yeah, what I can see that the topography makes the demand and supply is very far. So a supply of energy came from the remote areas, and demand is actually in cities, where how to connect the remote area to city, which is from a remote island to the demand, which is high intensity. So that one is one of the obstacles for Indonesia. So we are going to develop a smart grid, and of course this was is also very capital intensive, but that one is the solutions. So how to balance between the balance and to connect between the source or demand and supply. That is the energy of renewable.
Thank you very much, Bacagas, for that, for your response, and indeed to all of our excellent panelists for their participation today. I hope that you enjoyed the discussion. I certainly did, and I hope to ask your forgiveness for the fact that we overran slightly in time, but I could not resist the temptation to ask a couple of follow-up questions to such a distinguished group. And with that, I would close this second session of our event today and pass it back to our organizers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Tim Gold, and all the panelists. Give a round of virtual applause for all the panelists and moderator of panel to everyone. To all participants, we would like to remind you once again to don't forget to fill out the questionnaire in the chat box. Distinguished delegates, we are moving on to our final agenda of our workshop today. And to close this workshop, we would like to invite Mr. Tutuka Aryaji, the Director General of Oil and Gas of the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources of Indonesia, to deliver a closing remark. Please, Bapak.
Distinguished speakers, moderators, panelists, attendees, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to you all. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
I am very grateful with the discussion of today's webinar. We are able to take stocks of the current development of energy security with regard to energy prices, access, affordability, and recovery efforts from COVID-19. We have also discussed several possible actions to increase preparedness mechanisms and resilient global supply chains. Ladies and gentlemen, the recent conflict in Europe leads to an energy increasing, and as well as the price. It has put pressures on economies on the G20 countries and beyond, which was before impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic and has just started to bounce back. And it is important for the G20 countries to focus on people-centered energy transition to avoid negative impacts on access, availability, and affordability. It is also crucial for the G20 countries and beyond to take concrete actions to increase mitigation mechanisms and resilient energy supply, including in developing countries and emerging economies, which is heavily impacted by the recent energy prices hikes. Ladies and gentlemen, a secure and resilient energy supply chains for all available energy sources will be essential for future energy security and achieving the net zero emission target. All G20 members have set NZE targets, including Indonesia, in year 2060. In our long-term strategies, we are advancing our NZE 2060 roadmap through National Grand Strategy of Energy, which attempts to balance clean energy transition with national energy security. As the energy demand is growing alongside the increasing of population and economic growth, greater efforts will be needed for energy transitions. The transitions should be carried out comprehensively and prudently in multiple stages by considering competitiveness, cost, availability, and sustainability to ensure that the transition will run smoothly. Ladies and gentlemen, the government of Indonesia also realizes that ensuring the energy security needs cooperation and collaboration with all parties. Through collective global cooperation, we can increase the utilization of cleaner energy and boost the implementation of innovative clean technologies such as CCS in order to realize reliable, sustainable energy transition. To enhance international cooperation, the Indonesian G20 presidency of 22 is keen to promote three pillars, which the presidency has considered relevant to the current global challenges, which are global health architecture, digital economic transformation, and energy transitions. They are expected to actualize the presidency's main theme of Recover Together, Recover Stronger, which international communities are currently seeking for. Furthermore, the G20 Energy Transition Indonesian Presidency has set three main priorities issues, namely access, technology, and financing. These are three priorities issues are important aspects in addressing interlinked challenges between economic growth, energy security, and climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, finally, to ensure energy security, appropriate supporting policies and investment are needed. Having gained invaluable knowledge from all speakers and panelists, we are looking for to collaborating in taking concrete actions to maintain energy security during the energy transition in G20 members and beyond. Thank you very much. Very good afternoon.
Thank you, Baba. It's a wrap for today. So, Honorable Chair of Energy Transition Working Group, keynote speaker, moderators and panelists, representative of G20 members, and all the participants joining us today, on behalf of the Directorate General of Oil and Gas of the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources of Indonesia, and also International Energy Agency, IEA, as the coordinator of today's event, we would like to deliver our bunch of thanks to all the participants and all the attendees at this G20 webinar series. See you at another G20 webinar series. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Hey, Lyson, I'm sorry it took me so long. I was in this meeting. But it's perfect.